Have you ever wondered why a small fringe part of society has become so influential to make us adopt laws and have such influence in our schools and entertainment? I'm talking about the gay rights movement. Today I'm going to share with you how that happened and what our response should be.
How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Os Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF, Today God is First. Years ago, I began to focus my attention on implementing strategies designed to mobilize leaders in the 7 cultural mountains to impact the culture for Christ in the early 2000s. For years, we thought that the best way to influence culture was to have an evangelism campaign in our cities. These activities alone, though important, do not change society. They must include the dynamic of believers positioned at the top of each sphere of influence that defines culture, who become problem solvers in that culture, thereby giving godly influence over it. Jesus modeled what it means to be a culture shaper by solving problems in the lives of those he came in contact with. Whether it was healing the blind man, saving a woman from being stoned, helping Peter overcome a depressed fishing business, or feeding the 5,000, Jesus solved problems. And that is why people followed him. Culture change is very simple. Solve a problem, and you'll have more influence. Humans are born into a world at war. Each human being is born to discover and live out his or her personal story and thereby impact the larger story of the world that person lives in. Our story is usually always about us in the beginning, our desires, our needs, our crisis. This often leads us to a bigger story as a result of trying to reconcile our smaller story. This is often triggered by a major crisis. Braveheart is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a movie about one man's story, which became other people's story. William Wallace wanted to live a peaceable life in the countryside of Scotland. However, there was war going on in the land, brought on by a wicked king in England, who wanted to steal, kill, and destroy just like the devil. In the movie, his wife is killed by the English army. Wallace responds by revenging her death, killing those who killed his beloved bride. His warrior reputation spread to the common people throughout the land, who held the same hatred of the English as he did, but did not have the heart or courage to fight the English. Wallace inspired something in them. They joined him in the fight and ultimately defeated the English in many battles. Wallace was not able to finish the fight, though. He was betrayed by one of his own and executed by the English. It would take Robert the Bruce, his betrayer, who had a change of heart, to finish the work of freeing the Scottish people from the control of the English. But William Wallace was a change agent who became part of a larger story. Rarely do change agents grow up wanting to be change agents. Most of us settle for our smaller story. We don't think we have what it takes, so we resign ourselves to making the best of our circumstances merely to get by. Change the world? I am just trying to make it to the next paycheck, is often the sentiment for many of us. But God says there's more than our personal plight. There is a bigger story we are each called to. And God allows a crisis to take place in our smaller story to ignite the larger one that resides in each of us. Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham received a word from the Lord simultaneously about the role of the 7 mountains in shaping culture. During that same time, Francis Schaeffer, and founder of L'Abri, and Pat Robertson of Regent University and the Christian Broadcasting Network were given a similar message. That message was that if we are going to impact any nation for Christ, then we will have to affect the 7 spheres or mountains of society that are the pillars of any society. These 7 mountains are business, government, media, arts and entertainment, education, the family, and religion. There are many subgroups under these main categories. In essence, God was telling these 4 change agents where the battlefield was. It was here where culture would be won or lost. Their assignment was to raise up change agents to scale the mountains and to help a new generation of change agents understand the larger story. I have shared how God has been igniting men and women to see their work lives as holy callings from God for many years, how they've begun to realize the spiritual calling upon their lives. In the last few years, the message of the 7 mountains has begun to reemerge through many leaders simultaneously, many not knowing one another. I recall when God began speaking to me about this through my friend Lance Wallnau. I began to teach and share this message at international conferences. I'd been traveling internationally and had not been in my church for more than 3 months. When I returned, my pastor, Johnny Enlow, was in his 3rd message on the 7 Mountain Strategy. This series of messages became a book entitled The 7 Mountain Strategy. When God speaks simultaneously to leaders, we understand that He is doing something on the earth. I came across this verse of Scripture that captures the essence of the 7 Mountain Strategy, with the Lord being over all the mountains. Quote, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us His ways, and we shall walk in His paths." That's Isaiah 2:2 and 3. I realize that culture is defined by a relatively small number of change agents who operate at the tops of these cultural mountains. It takes less than 3 to 5% of those operating at the top of a cultural mountain to actually shift the values represented on that mountain. This is exactly what the gay rights movement has done through the mountains of media, arts and entertainment, and the other spheres. They are gradually legitimizing their cause through these 2 mountains and the others, but they've penetrated all 7. Mountains are controlled by a small percentage of leaders and networks. James Hunter, in a 2002 Trinity Forum briefing, highlights what sociologist Randall Collins says about civilizations in his book, The Sociology of Philosophies. According to Collins, civilizations have been defined by a very small percentage of cultural philosophers who influence 7 gates and supporting networks since our birth as a civilization. Hunter summarizes, even if we add the minor figures in all the networks and all of the civilizations, the total is only 2,700 people. In some, between 150 and 3,000 people, a tiny fraction of the roughly 23 billion people living between 600 BC and AD 1900, are responsible for shaping culture. That's why we must realize that making more conversions will not necessarily change culture. It's important to have conversions, but it's more important to have those who are converted operate at the tops of the cultural mountains from a biblical worldview. Those at the tops of these mountains are expressing a worldview about each influence. The more liberal and ungodly the change agents at the top, the more liberal and ungodly the culture. The more godly the change agent at the top, the more righteous the culture will be. It doesn't matter if the majority of the culture is made up of Christians. It only matters who has the greatest influence over that cultural mountain, and the mountain of family must undergird all other cultural mountains. For the last several decades, culture has been increasingly secular and liberal in the United States, but God has always raised up His change agents to represent His interests and agenda on planet Earth. God is raising up His change agents for such a time as this. We know that Jesus will return for a bride, that He might present her to Himself, a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, she should be holy and without blemish. So despite the trends we may see, I believe we need to operate from a victorious eschatology viewpoint. God's current activity in the marketplace is part of this. He's calling His church to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This means applying God's mind to the natural order expressed through the cultural mountains of society. There is an analogy that best describes American culture today. It goes like this. A frog jumped into the cool water in a kettle, not realizing the heat had been turned on. Gradually, the heat began to build, and the frog adjusted to the warmer temperature. However, the heat became very hot, and the frog did not notice the extreme heat until he was burned to death in the kettle. We are just like that in America. We've been sitting in the kettle of a cultural slide into liberalism, socialism, and Marxism that is just now beginning to alarm Christians to the point they are ready to do something about it. How did we get here? Well, unchristian co-author Gabe Lyons says America was practically Christian just a handful of years ago. But in the past several decades, our country's predominant self-perceptions have been challenged and replaced. So although many of us still feel like we reside in Christian America, that reality is dead. We've been losing the 7 mountains of culture to liberal influences for 3 distinct reasons. The first reason is simple. We have separated ourselves and our nation from God. As we became more prosperous as a nation, we became less dependent on God. Unfortunately, humility and prosperity often do not coexist. We gave up dominion when Adam and Eve fell, and we failed to reclaim it because of our own sins of self-satisfaction, complacency toward God, and our iniquities. You see, our enemies didn't have to kill us. We simply disobeyed God, which entitled our enemies to take our mountains. Over the centuries, there have been major tipping points in our culture that led to a continual falling away from the foundations God gave us to live by in our nation. God laid out His requirements to the nation of Israel, which can be applied to every nation on earth. Deuteronomy 28:15-19 says, "However, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all His commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. You'll be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed, and the crops of your land, and the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. You will be cursed when you come in, and cursed when you go out." In February 1988, a meeting was held with 175 gay activists in Warrenton, Virginia. Marshall Kirk, a Harvard-educated researcher in neuropsychiatry, and Hunter Madsen, who held a doctorate in politics from Harvard and was an expert in persuasion tactics and social marketing, were the conveners of this meeting. In their book, After the Ball, a strategic battle plan was written to make being gay acceptable in the minds of Americans. He said, "AIDS gives us a chance, however brief, to establish ourselves as a victimized minority, legitimately deserving of America's special protection and care. It generates mass hysteria of precisely the sort that has brought about public stoning and leper colonies since the Dark Ages and before. How can we maximize the sympathy and minimize the fear? How, given the hard hand that AIDS has dealt us, can we best play it?" This was the beginning of a public relations multi-year plan. They developed a public relations Bible of the gay movement. They outlined the key strategies for the movement in their book. Their goals included break current negative associations with our cause and replace them with positive associations, change what people actually think and feel, reframe the terms of the battle, seek desensitization and nothing more until it doesn't matter anymore. Make it unlawful to discriminate against gays. In the last few years, we've seen an acceleration of deviant, anti-God beliefs in our country, ushered in by less than 3 to 9% of a leadership in this nation that is telling the population that it's okay to believe you are not born male or female. You can choose the sex you want to be without your parents' approval. Men can have babies. It's perfectly fine to promote drag programs to your young children in public schools. It's okay to have explicit sexual books that promote deviant homosexuality and transgenderism. You can be arrested in some countries if you try to help someone become free of homosexuality or teach what the Bible says about it. We can expect more of this as the nation moves further and further away from God's values. Most of us hear the rationale of gay activists that they are born gay rather than their sexual preference being an influence of how they were raised and the exposure to societal factors and childhood wounds that predisposed them to this lifestyle. After the ball, authors Kirk and Manson made an amazing admission in their book. Quote, "We argue that for all practical purposes, gays should be considered to have been born gay, even though sexual orientation for most humans seems to be the product of a complex interaction between innate predispositions and environmental factors during childhood and early adolescence." Here you have an amazing admission by gay leaders. We are not born gay, they say, but they will never admit that in public. What is their ultimate goal? It isn't just getting acceptance, it's far more than that. David Capulian explains, the end game is not only to bring about the complete acceptance of homosexuality, including same-sex marriage, but also to prohibit and even criminalize public criticism of homosexuality. In other words, total jamming of criticism with the force of law. This is already the case in Canada and parts of Scandinavia, and starting to even show up in America. They began to win the culture when they shifted their argument from being a moral issue to being a civil issue. You see, once the government bought that lie, the battle was over. They learned from the civil rights movement and began to present their cause as a discriminated class of people. In other words, their preference for a lifestyle was changed to be a civil rights issue. Let's face it, God didn't create Adam and Joe. He created Adam and Eve. However, being right about an issue has very little redemptive value in helping a gay person who we know is in bondage but may be unwilling to admit it. The faster our nation moves from the truths of the Bible, the faster we become a reprobate nation that creates a leanness in our soul as a nation and in our people. I always wondered why leaders in Washington seem to increasingly have no common sense in their decisions. It is explained in the following two verses in Romans and Psalms. Quote, "Likewise also the men leaving the natural use of the woman burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, and disobedient to parents." That's Romans 1:27-30. "And he gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul." Psalm 106:15. The only solution to this woundedness in the soul of this community is a revival in their hearts that heals the wounds and allows the community to find real, genuine love they so desperately seek. Unless that happens, we'll be in a continual war with this community who seeks to require acceptance and even endorsement at every level. And because the root stronghold of this behavior is rejection, this community is often radicalized toward their agenda, requiring acceptance through legal and government intervention. So, as you think about where we are as a nation, I want to encourage you to pray to break the stronghold that's over our nation there's a sexual spirit over our nation that's come into our children in grade schools, and it's proliferating even through teachers that are supposed to be there to raise our children, and yet we're being attacked at every level. And so I pray that you'll take these thoughts and consider what your response should be. And I hope that you'll join me to be a member of the Change Agent Master Mentor Program that brings together leaders like yourself in an online platform. You can learn more about that at camastermentor.com. That's www.camastermentor.com. God bless.